As someone fascinated by things like myth and folklore, ancient religion and demonology, I've repeatedly encountered this idea of something referred to as the Noonday Demon or Devil, also known as the Midday Demon or Meridian Demon. The concept seems to stem from the idea that there's a destructive force or phenomenon that can befall one at midday, as referenced in Psalm 91, 5-6 of the Hebrew Bible. To give some context, Psalm 91 discusses, in part at least, the various things people who take refuge in God need not fear. The New American Standard Version reads, "You will not be afraid of the terror by night, or of the arrow that flies by day, of the plague that stalks in darkness, or of the destruction that devastates at noon." As is always the case, the specific wording depends on the translation. For instance, the King James Version reads, "The destruction that wasteth at noonday." One common interpretation I found that occurred to me as well is that this might simply be, at least on face value, a reference to the destructive power of the scorching noonday sun. However, in St. Jerome's Vulgate, his translation of the Bible into Latin, he seems to personify this destructive noonday force as the Demonium Meridianum. The following is from an extract from a work entitled The Demonium Meridianum and Greek and Latin Patristic Exegesis, published online by Cambridge University Press. Discussing the laws of purification and diet in the Old Testament, J. Dollar, who I believe from what I could glean was a turn-of-the-century biblical scholar and/or Orientalist, thought it possible to discover in the Bible a few faint vestiges of a popular belief in demons among the Israelites, and saw a plague demon especially in the destruction that lays waste at noonday. Referring to Dollar's study, S. Landersdorfer, who I believe was yet another biblical scholar/Orientalist, pointed to a parallel Assyrian belief which regarded midnight and noonday as periods especially dangerous and haunted by demonic agencies, and was inclined to assume, even for the Masoretic text, the idea of a demon of night and a demon of noonday. Both demons were thought to exercise their power, especially at the hours of the chilling midnight cold and the scorching noonday heat, and to be responsible for certain bodily disorders, such as sunstroke and malaria fever, and for other diseases caused by the rapid changes of temperature in the southern deserts. In this case, the psalmist would already have alluded to a popular belief, though such an allusion would not necessarily imply that he himself shared the view. The OSB in Eastern Orthodox Study Bible still uses a translation of the Septuagint, a Greek language version of the Hebrew Bible, in which Psalm 91:6 reads, "Nor by a thing moving in darkness, nor by mishap and a demon of noonday." It should be noted that although Jerome had translated the Jewish Bible from the original Hebrew, he had also previously translated parts of the Septuagint as well, including the Book of Psalms, and perhaps this is where he encountered the idea of this destructive noonday force being personified or referred to as a demonic entity. I actually found a translation of the Septuagint, and Psalm 96 reads, "Nor of the evil thing that walks in darkness, nor of calamity and the evil spirit at noonday." And just quickly for clarification, the Septuagint has that specific psalm listed as 90, whereas most Bibles we're familiar with would have it listed as 91. And a further clarification, it may have sounded like I was saying I was reading from Psalm 96 in the Septuagint. What I meant was Psalm 90 verse 6. But the concept of a destructive or wasting force associated with midday would continue to evolve with the work of a 4th century Christian monk by the name of Evagrius Ponticus, Devoted to an ascetic life and having spent time in the desert, he was also known as Evagrius the Solitary. Evagrius had developed and compiled a list of 8 evil thoughts or terrible temptations. There's a Greek word meaning thought that's often used in this context, and I encountered 2 pronunciations. One is logismoi and one is logismi. I'm not sure which is more appropriate or correct. The following is from an English translation of Evagrius's Practicos, meaning, you guessed it, practical in Greek. There are 8 principal kinds of tempting thoughts that contain within themselves every tempting thought. First, that of gluttony, and with it sexual immorality. Third, that of love of money. Fourth, that of sadness. Fifth, that of anger. Sixth, that of acedia. Seventh, that of vainglory. Eighth, that of pride. We cannot control whether these tempting thoughts can agitate the soul or not, but whether they remain in us or not, and whether they move the passions or not, that we can control. In 590 AD, Pope Gregory the Great would revisit Evagrius's list, making the decision to combine what was known as tristitia, sadness in Latin, and acedia from the Greek acedia, meaning apathy or listlessness, into a single sin known as sloth. He would also combine vainglory and pride and add envy, bringing the number of wicked thoughts or temptations down from 8 to 7, the 7 deadly sins. Living a monastic life, Evagrius's list was primarily developed with monks like himself and the spiritual challenges they faced in mind. He wrote the following of sadness. Sadness sometimes arises from frustrated desires, but sometimes it is the result of anger. When desires are frustrated, it arises thus. Certain tempting thoughts first seize the soul, and reminded of home and parents and its former course of life. When they see the soul following them without resistance and dissipating itself into mental pleasures, they take and dunk it in sadness, since it is the case that these earlier things are gone and cannot be recovered due to the monk's present way of life. Then the miserable soul, having been dissipated by the first tempting thought, is humiliated all the more by the second. The following is concerning acedia. The demon of acedia, which is also called the Noonday Demon, is the most burdensome of all the demons. It besets the monk at about the 4th hour, 10 a.m. of the morning, encircling his soul until about the 8th hour, 2 p.m. First, it makes the sun seem to slow down or stop moving, so that the day appears to be 50 hours long. Then it makes the monk keep looking out of his window and forces him to go bounding out of his cell to examine the sun to see how much longer it is to 3 o'clock. And to look around in all directions, in case any of the brethren is there. Then it makes him hate the place and the way of life and his manual work. It makes him think that there is no charity left among the brethren. No one is going to come and visit him. If anyone has upset the monk recently, the demon throws this in too to increase his hatred. It makes him desire other places where he can easily find all that he needs and practice an easier, more convenient craft. After all, pleasing the Lord is not dependent on geography, the demon adds. God is to be worshipped everywhere. It joins to this the remembrance of the monk's family and his previous way of life, and suggests to him that he still has a long time to live, raising up before his eyes a vision of how burdensome the ascetic life is. So it employs, as they say, every possible means to move the monk to abandon his cell and give up the race. No other demon follows on immediately after this, but after its struggle, the soul is taken over by a peaceful condition and by unspeakable joy. I should note that Evagrius also addresses these 8 wicked thoughts or temptations in another of his works called Anti-Reticos. a Greek term which is thought to mean something like refutation or talking back. In it, along with his commentary, he provides bits of chapter and verse to help one combat these troublesome thoughts or temptations. Sloth, this mix of sadness, indolence, and apathy, would come to be regarded as arguably the most insidious and dangerous or destructive of the 7 deadly sins. Not only because it robbed one of motivation or the ability or desire to take action, but also because in the form of despair, it was in a sense the antithesis of faith, and could even ultimately lead one to commit what was considered the mortal sin of taking one's own life. The renowned ancient Greek physician and philosopher Hippocrates, considered to be the founder of modern medicine, referred to sloth or depression as melancholia, coming from the Greek words for black and bile. He believed it was caused by an imbalance in the 4 quote-unquote humors, or bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. As implied by the name, melancholia was thought to be caused by an excess of black bile specifically. Some of the symptoms Hippocrates associated with melancholia were persistent fear or anxiety, sadness, loss of appetite, and withdrawing from the world. The idea of the 4 humors continued on into medieval medicine. Treatments meant to address the problem of excess bile associated with melancholia, such as induced vomiting, bleeding, and enemas, were considered so unpleasant that they were seen as serving as a deterrent to giving oneself over to sloth. Whereas the ancient Greeks and Romans had viewed melancholia or depression as a medical condition, medieval Christians tended to view it, at least in part, as a spiritual affliction, carrying with it a certain stigma, the thinking being that the cause might be demonic in nature, or that it was a sign of God's disfavor. In Dante's Inferno, those guilty of anger and those guilty of sloth both occupy the 5th circle of hell. Those consumed with anger strike each other in a muddy swamp or bog, while the slothful lie submerged below the surface. Underneath the waters dwells a multitude whose sighs into these bubbles make the surface heave, as thine eye tells thee wheresoever it turn. Fixed in the slime, they say, sad once were we in the sweet air made gladsome by the sun, carrying a foul and lazy mist within. Now in these murky settings are we sad, such dolorous strain they gurgle in their throats, but word distinct can utter none. In 1589, a German auxiliary bishop and theologian by the name of Peter Binsfeld, who had been involved in the witch hunts and was well versed in demonology, published a list of demons, including those associated with the 7 deadly sins. According to Binsfeld, the demon of sloth was called Belphegor, a name seemingly derived from that of the ancient Assyrian god Baal Peor. Due to Baal meaning Lord and Peor meaning opening, Belphegor was sometimes referred to as the Lord of the Gap or opening. I was surprised to learn that about 40 years earlier, in 1549, Italian diplomat and author Niccolo Machiavelli, famous for his work The Prince, had published a fictional story entitled Belphegor Archidiavolo, meaning something like Belphegor the Archdemon, in which the archdevil Belphegor comes to Earth in human form to find a mate. Belphegor also appears in John Milton's 17th century epic poem, Paradise Lost, and is also catalogued in de Plancy's 1818 Dictionnaire Infernal. I have to admit, one of the reasons I felt compelled to do this episode, other than that it's fun to talk about demons, is that the subject matter personally resonates with me. I myself am susceptible to depressive bouts, and I've long noticed that my own mood tends to sink at certain times of day. And for me it usually is somewhere in the afternoon, and then also around sunset, and then my mood seems to be the highest early in the morning and then late at night. But another thing I discovered during my research is that there was a 17th century English author, vicar, and fellow at Oxford University named Robert Burton, who wrote an encyclopedic treatise on what we would now call depression, which he entitled The Anatomy of Melancholy. Burton himself had personally struggled with melancholy for most of his life, and he writes in the preface, of a kind of imposthume, a new word to me, apparently it means an abscess, in my head, he writes, which I was very desirous to be unladen of, and could imagine no fitter evacuation than this. I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy. There is no greater cause of melancholy than idleness, no better cure than business. And this reminded me of our own time, with our present mental health epidemic. He writes, a disease so frequent in our miserable times, as few there are that feel not the smart of it. To prescribe means how to prevent and cure. So universal a malady, an epidemical disease, that so often, so much, crucifies the body and mind. Burton had been so consumed or preoccupied with the study of melancholy that his memorial stone, on the wall of Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford, referencing him by his pseudonym Democritus Jr., reads when translated from Latin, known to few, unknown to fewer, here lies Democritus Jr., to whom melancholy gave life and death. Burton had died 5 months after drawing up his will, at the age of 62 on January 25th in the year 1640. Despite discouraging suicide or the promotion of it by certain classical authors in his Anatomy of Melancholy, rumors began to circulate after his death that he had taken his own life. The truth of the matter still seems to remain something of a matter of contention, although the consensus seems to lean towards the idea that his taking his own life was just a rumor. He was buried in a cathedral which apparently wouldn't have been allowed had his death been a suicide. Others have tried to push back, suggesting his suicide may have been covered up or kept a secret by the close-knit Oxford community. Burton seemed to have been of the mind that melancholy was both a medical condition and a spiritual affliction. On the one hand, he seems to have held a relatively enlightened view of the condition, and yet on the other, he details how various kinds of devils or spirits may have the power to afflict the soul with their harmful influence. He writes, thus the devil reigns, and in 1,000 several shapes, as a roaring lion seeks whom he may devour. By earth, sea, land, air, as yet unconfined, though some will have his proper place, the air. All that space between us and the moon, for them that transgressed least, and hell for the wickedest of them. But be he where he will, he rageth while he may to comfort himself, as Lactantius thinks. With other men's falls he labors all he can to bring them into the same pit of perdition with him. For men's miseries, calamities, and ruins are the devil's banqueting dishes. However, despite this, rather than calling for an exorcist, Burton suggests fairly commonsensical and often effective, time-honored treatments for melancholy, such as avoiding idleness and prolonged isolation, seeking out mirth, music, and social interaction, engaging in exercise and maintaining a healthy diet, etc., as well as trying to exercise patience while waiting for the episode to eventually pass. Evagrius himself advised perseverance. Perseverance is the cure for acedia, along with the execution of all tasks with great attention, which reminds me of the Buddhist concept of mindfulness. Set a measure for yourself in every work and do not let up until you have completed it. Another tactic espoused by desert fathers like Evagrius was the shedding of tears, which was seen as the outward expression of sincere repentance or need for a savior. This show of tearful emotion was thought to combat the apathy of acedia. There was also, as alluded to earlier, the method of talking back to the negative or evil thoughts that arise, which sounds surprisingly similar to modern cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. Well, whether you believe in an actual noonday devil or, like myself, simply see it as a poignant metaphor for melancholy, here's to keeping it at bay. As always, thank you for listening, and until next time.